So BALLE's actually been around for about 18 years at this point, and so our role is really focused around supporting dynamic community leaders that are advancing inclusive economic development efforts in their communities, particularly through entrepreneurship and small business development, with a focus around minority entrepreneurs, women of color, indigenous entrepreneurs, really building different kind of business models where employee ownership is a focus, and also working in communities that are rural as well. So we have a fellowship program of 101 individuals across the US and Canada in over 40 communities doing this type of work. Some are working on accelerator programs, some have like small place-based funds. And then we also work with about 45 place-based foundations across the US and Canada as well to support them to invest back into their communities in a very inclusive, equitable manner. So I think an inclusive economy really is one in which every stakeholder, particularly those who have been most marginalized in the community, have the opportunity to actually shape what that economy looks like. So that their voice is heard, not just heard, but they have opportunity to have access to capital, to really ideate and create things. It's really an economy in which everyone can participate, and so not just a few. And I think particularly in the communities that we work with in BALLE, where there are majority communities of color, majority communities in which economically marginalized folks just don't have the opportunity to actually build their own wealth and retain it in community. It's really important to have an inclusive economy. So oftentimes there's conversations when we talk about inclusion, there's also diversity and equity. So when I think about equity, I think about power. And so to the point, the phrase that we need to be at the table, a lot of people, particularly in our network, are saying, we're building a table. Let's build our own table, and others can come and participate with us in this process. So that's an equity question, to make sure that folks are able to have the agency, the resources to build without having to over-rely on anyone else. So that's an equity, that's a power conversation. When you think about inclusion, it's really, there's a table. How do we make sure that's as diverse as possible? How do we acknowledge the blind spots that we may have to ensure that everyone's voice is being considered as we move something forward? So localism is really important, and we actually been thinking about this as not just as localism, but it's really being community grounded. And I think particularly over the last several years, I think you see the political spectrum in our country and sort of the ways that we are unable to have certain conversations as a community. However, when you focus on a place, when you make things local, you can really get past all those kind of conversations. You can really focus on what's happening in your community. So it's really fascinating to be able to see different people across the political divide actually be able to come together and say, hey, we need a grocery store. We've got a food desert in this community, right? So we need to actually have a grocery store there. We can come together around that, and it's a local question. It's not one that's going to split people up around politics or policies. It's really a conversation about what is really important to the place that we actually love and care about. So I think that's why localism and being really community grounded is important, because quite frankly, it's the only way I believe that we can have these diverse people come together without having this sort of divisiveness that I think we see in the political world right now. Yeah, actually, I'm a big proponent of the one pocket strategy. It's pretty remarkable that we have a structure right now in institutional philanthropy in which you only leverage 5% of your endowment on an annual basis to drive positive change. And really, when you think about it, it's actually not even full 5%, because that 5% includes consultants, that includes staff time, that includes a whole range of things that actually might not impact a community in a positive way. So I joke that it's usually probably 2.5% of the endowment that's actually used in these sort of ways. So the way I think about it is, one of the things is, foundations, institutional philanthropy are very concerned with their own perpetuity. And one of the things I think a lot about, and I've had a lot of conversations with a number of foundation leaders and high net worth individuals that are starting their own donor advised funds and those sort of things, is how do you think about creating perpetual community wealth? Leveraging your capital to do just that. So not necessarily focusing on the perpetuity of the institution that you stood up, but in fact thinking about how do you have a more vibrant Baltimore? because you're investing in ways that might actually over time lower your endowment, but actually creates the economic power and muscle that's required for communities to thrive. And so I think this is like the merger of the two themes. I've even had conversations with a few family foundations that have said, you know, we're not going to spend down. All we're suggesting is that we're going to just retain the size of our endowment, which is incredible. It seems like a small shift, but really most institutional philanthropy are trying to grow their endowment, not just retain. So when you make the decision to say, hey, we're just going to retain the endowment, it allows for much more creativity in terms of how you're deploying capital, what types of things you invest in. So I really appreciate the one pocket mindset. It's oftentimes there's a lot of underlying data that indicates that, for example, the people experiencing homelessness or bouts of homelessness, it is actually tied to didn't have childcare, for example. So that led to a bout of unemployment that didn't allow them not to afford rent, for example. So I see this quite a bit, particularly in the work that I used to do in Baltimore, where people were faced between making a payment on rent, making a payment on their car so they can get to work, making sure and not having the opportunity to really come back to getting back on track. And then there's a domino effect, and making that decision to pay for that car note ends up being they're living in that car note, or living in that car rather. And so I think that's sort of really rethinking about what homelessness looks like and the factors that lead people into homelessness is a significant barrier. I think we see this in other areas too, in higher education, for example. Oftentimes people think that folks drop out of college for a whole lot of reasons that it's actually because folks have like a $400 break in between payments and can't afford it and have trouble going back. So we see this in a number of different areas outside of just housing and homelessness. We see this in a broad array of areas where the social service entities are trying to address.